Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsay, a psychologist in Silicon Valley and the host of SuperPsyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. SuperPsyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. I love regional accents. They tend to warm my heart and make me feel closer and even curious about a person's origins. That said, have you ever wondered why people from various spots on the globe and within your own country have different accents? Where do they come from? When I learned that a SuperPsyched guest, University of Nevada at Reno linguistics professor and author, Dr. Valerie Fridland had written a book on this topic, I knew I had to geek out with her. The book, Why We Talk Funny, The Real Story Behind Our Accents, is a fun and engrossing read. And I'm confident you'll love the book and this interview. So listen in as a top-notch linguistics professor shares some fascinating facts on why we talk funny. Dr. Valerie Fridland, who has asked me to call her Valerie, welcome back to SuperPsyched.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here.
You have no idea how much I loved, like literally, dude. And now we've got Why We Talk Funny. And this is so ridiculously in my geek zone. I take great joy in hearing regional accents and accents from countries. Last night, I actually spoke to a woman from Belarus, and it was just a gateway opener for me to use my insufficient Russian with her. But intelligible.
I'm impressed you have any Russian.
But intelligible.
You had me at Russian.
But I love doing that. And my kids always crack up because I love accents. I love accents. And as Trevor Noah says, that when you greet somebody in their language that is old, you are tipping your hat to them and saying, I recognize that you come from a rich background. And I believe that even though you're glib calling it Why We Talk Funny, it's done as you would through the lens of profound respect for the origins. Let's talk about regional accents and how you as a linguist got interested in this topic.
Absolutely. Well, first, just on the name, the Why We Talk Funny, the real story behind our accents. The reason we called it that is because that is something people say all the time about people that sound different than they do.
Right.
And, when I was a little kid, which is how I got into sort of studying accents, I grew up in the South, and my parents are actually non-native speakers. They both came to the United States speaking French. And at that time in the South, I'm not going to tell you how long ago, but it was long enough that there weren't a lot of foreigners in the South. Whenever my sort of background of French would come out with my friends, the first thing that these little Southern kids would say is, you talk funny or you sound funny. That was really something I heard growing up. Or, my parents would constantly be talked about with their accent. And most times people said how charming it was. But there's always this undercurrent of it's separating you, it's different, it's you sound funny, you sound different. And that's really where that title came from, more about how people often hear things that don't sound like they do as funny or different or noticeable in some way. And so that it is a glib title, but it really comes from an experiential perspective. And that's really how I got interested in dialects. I grew up in the South, where obviously there is a really strong accent, or at least when we can talk about that, maybe less strong of an accent than there used to be. But there's a lot of, I would even say, stigma about the Southern accent. And people in the South are very self-aware, more than in other regions where people don't really either realize they have an accent or feel very confident in their accent as it being sort of a good mainstream standard accent, like a Midwesterner. In the South, people are both proud of their accent for the heritage it represents, just like you talked about with Trevor Noah. It has a history. It means something to them. But at the same time, they're also very aware at all the stereotypes about Southerners, all the depictions in media about Southerners, how when there's a tornado coming through, they find that one Southern person with no shirt on and no shoes and a Southern accent to interview. And it sort of just pushes that Southern stereotype out there. So, I was aware of it from the Southern perspective. I was aware of it from the non-native speaker's daughter's perspective. And I didn't realize it at 5 that was priming me to become a linguist. But by the time I got to college, I'd had a lot of experience with how people were around accents and talked about them and how they really were part of your identity. So that when I took a linguistics course as just part of my major, which was actually Chinese, all of a sudden it was like the light came on and I thought, dang, this is so interesting and it explains so much. It was like all the answers I had been looking for came to light. And that was really what made me decide to pursue it in graduate school.
I love it. And I love the glib titles. They are relatable. They're funny. They're a wink. And they make me want to read your books because you do have a good sense of humor. And you are taking...
Yeah, I like to make jokes.
Yeah. And we know that humor is correlated with greater learning. So if you were to come up with this dry text with a crap title and boring prose, it would sell to 2 people. This is something that people will want to read. Just to be clear, listener, if you haven't checked out Like Literally Dude or this book, her words fly off the page. She is so much fun to read or listen to on Audible. Anyway, here is a question that I've been just so curious about from a linguist's perspective. It seems, from my knowledge, that children are more influenced by their peers than by their parents' linguistic tendencies. And yet, growing up in the Bay Area, I was born in Spanish Harlem and I grew up to 2 East Coasters. The kids in my class, even though I speak with what could be considered a very Californian accent when I'm in New York, in California, they say, gosh, you sound kind of like a New Yorker over here. And I'm not sure if this has anything to do with my Judaism or whatever, but what's going on with the sources of influence, whether it's peers or parents?
You're absolutely right. And actually, I devote a whole chapter to the topic of how children are the inspiration for accent in so many ways. And then really, it's a 2-part inspiration. They get it from their parents and they get it from their friends. And it's really a matter of timing. So when you're in vitro and then born, your primary exposures to your parents typically. And even in the womb, babies can hear their mother's speech, but it's filtered through the amniotic fluid and, of course, tissues. So it's not like they can hear sounds, but they hear the rhythm. And in fact, they seem to very soon after birth, too soon to have gotten it in post-birth situation, to actually recognize the rhythms that are in their own language versus those of other languages. They also seem to recognize their mother's voice. So you're getting input from your parent before you're even born about your language. And I know in the new world, there are more men that take care of their children, but typically it has been historically moms that do that. So most of this research on parental influence has focused on mothers at the early stages. And so fathers are also influential, but what we find is the speech of the mother actually teaches the child a lot of things about their language. So first of all, you're learning the basic sounds and rhythms of your language early on. Well, you're not talking to a bunch of friends in kindergarten yet. You don't have a lot of baby friends, so you're hanging out with your parents most of the time. So they're primary in that really sort of spongy stage of early childhood. That first year, yes, babies can't eat by themselves and they can't poop by themselves. Well, they do that by themselves, but they're not finding the toilet, right? Well, there's a reason, because their brains are so unbelievably active doing the hard work of acquiring language that it's astounding that they can do anything else at all. So, let's cut them some slack on not using utensils because I think they're pretty busy. By the age of 1, a child has figured out what sounds will exist in their language as opposed to what sounds will not. So by, around 6 months, they're babbling in universal sounds. By a year, they have tuned in through their parents' speech to what sounds will be in their language and what sounds aren't. So they're kind of honing that down and they have the system. And then they're also having to learn to put those sounds into words and follow the rules of their language. I mean, it's a pretty intense language formation period. By the time they go to school, they're talkers, right? So who are they talking like? They're talking like their parents. And what we find is that till about the age of 4 or 5, if you go to preschool, it might be a little earlier, children talk more like their parents. They have a lot of the same system of their parents. Now, if your parents are foreign, like mine were, and you were born somewhere else, like I was, you actually hear enough input from other people that you are not talking exactly like your parents. You can't hear the difference in their speech. So if you have parents that have a foreign accent, you don't hear it because your brain has already adjusted to that being part of your experience. And so you don't hear it as different. And therefore, it doesn't sound accented to you. But your own speech will be moderated by sort of frequencies that you hear around you. So if you only grew up in a place where only people sounding like your parents were there, that's what you'd sound like. But that's not what happens to babies. They have other input. And sort of they do the statistical learning process where they're going to end up sounding more like sort of a homogenized version of what they hear around them. But they will have features of their parents' speech. So, for example, a story I tell in the book is how when I was about 5 or 6, I was describing a toy I had gotten, which was this gigantic teddy bear. And I was, doing show. It was for show and tell in my school. And I said, "Oh my gosh, he's huge."
Huge.
And, I had no idea that I had French phonology, right? But in French, you don't have H's.
Yes.
As Latin didn't, right? So Latin didn't have H's, which is then created a whole sort of reintroduction of H's in English words in Britain when H pronunciation became very trendy. So Latin didn't pronounce its H's. In some of the educated dialect, they broadened them back, but typically vulgar Latin didn't have them. French developed, like Spanish and Italian, from the common Latin, the vulgar Latin that everyday people spoke. It doesn't have H's either. My parents didn't speak with H's at the beginning of words. So hour, huge, all those things, hotel, they just didn't have their H's. I would say exactly the same things my parents said. I had no idea I didn't have H's, but everybody in my kindergarten class noticed. That's all they noticed. Not my cool teddy bear, but my lack of H's. And so that made me really notice that. And then for the rest of that year, I basically spit every time I pronounced the word huge because I wanted that H to come out. So that sort of trained it out of me. So then around 5 is when really we start kids doing something called vernacular reorganization, which is where they go from the model of their parents or their primary caregivers or the people they spend time around to the model of their peers. Because as everybody knows who's ever been to school, peers are way more cool than parents. Yes. And also, we have a lot going on cognitively. We also have a lot going on socially, and this sort of intensity of social identity formation, meeting language acquisition causes this attraction to the features of your local community. And that's really where we get that influence. So you will still often have small traces of maybe what your parents said, but you actually then shift to the system of what your friends say. And that tends to be the dominant influence, which is why kids like me that have parents that speak a foreign language don't sound like those parents, because you actually do sound more like your peers than your parents. But that influence is often there. And I think what you're probably getting called on is certain words you say or certain sounds you say that you learned not as a system, but sort of as an iconic part of that identity without realizing it, that come out, and that's what people notice. So for me, sometimes I don't sound very Southern, but there are traits in my speech that are Southern. And there are also some traits in my speech that are left over from my parents. And that combination doesn't really sound like anything, but it is noticeable as sounding like something, if that makes sense.
Makes 100% sense. And I use the word orange instead of orange in my circles, which sounded absolutely ridiculous, except for the fact that that's how it's said in New Jersey, where my mom is from.
Absolutely.
And I'm thinking about Ormond's character in Mad Men, where she's talking to Sterling. She's French, and she says that she wants happiness, except she's French. And so it sounds like, I want happiness. And so, of course, he looks at her kind of askance, like, wait, what are you saying? And he realizes she's saying happiness. So huge is far easier than what poor Ormond went through.
Yes, at least I wasn't talking about the happiness.
You're right, the happiness thing. So it was pretty great. But I'm also thinking just about the slow wave brain states of being between the ages of 2 and 4. I believe that we're in somewhere a theta-ish state during that time. And so the language comes at us very slowly so that we can acquire and do the hard work of language acquisition during that time. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I remember learning that at some point. Regardless, let's zoom out and talk about regional accents, because to me, it strikes me as absolutely bizarre that here are these colonies, one in Massachusetts known as Boston, one in New York known as New York, and one in Pennsylvania known as, say, Philadelphia. Three very different ways of saying water, three very different accents. My favorite, of course, being the Bostonian accent, because there's just nothing funnier than listening to my grandpa, who was from New England. He actually literally uttered the greatest phrase known to humans. He literally was trying to teach me how to park my car. And yes, you know the park your car and Havidia, but he actually blew it away. He said, when you park your car, make sure you park your car away from the other cars so the other cars don't hit your car. And I had him repeat that sentence 5 times, acting like I didn't understand what he was talking about, because it was just the best sentence I've ever heard.
It's a great Boston sentence.
It's the best. But how did that evolve? Like, how did that come about, and why is it different from New York?
You know, it's really interesting, because if we think of these as being really long set in accents, but a lot of what you're talking about are actually 19th century innovations. And so when we look at the early colonial dialects and the first colonies, New England has always been one of the sort of most salient dialect regions of the United States, even before it was the United States. So the way that it was settled, it was very different than the Virginia colonies. And at first, in early colonial history, what we really had was the Virginia colony and the Massachusetts colony. And those were sort of the two. Now, New York was actually a Dutch colony. Right. So there's actually still,
New Amsterdam, right.
Yeah. So there's actually still a lot of Dutch influence. Now, the British did take it over not too much later, but there's still a lot of Dutch influence in New York. In fact, a lot of the Flushings and Flanders and those things are Dutch names that actually were sort of Americanized or put more into English afterwards. And there's still a lot of Dutch history in the New Amsterdam, which became New York after the Duke of York. So that was sort of a little later of a development, because it was really a Dutch colony at the time. But first we had New England settled and Jamestown settled. Well, Jamestown before New England, because Southerners are always first. I have to say that as a plug for as a Southerner. But the difference in the way they were settled was really important in the later development of dialect differences regionally. But early on in the 1600s, when those colonies were first settled, they actually probably didn't sound that different. What they did sound very different from was Britain. When we look at early documents, travel logs, and comments about people who traveled to the colonies that were just leaving Britain at that time and coming to the colonies for trade or settled, they constantly remark on is this distinctly American sound. So within the first 100 years of the settlement of the colonies, we had a different accent in the American colonies than we had in Britain. So it took probably within about 50 years that it started to become uniquely American. And then by 100 years, it was commented on about how uniform the American accent was. So no matter where you traveled in the old, Philadelphia, New England, Virginia, that really what was overwhelming is that you couldn't tell a man from the sound of his voice. In contrast, and in fact, we see it commented on almost in exactly that form by a number of people, in contrast to the state of Britain, where everybody knew where everybody was from and what class they were in by the sound of their voice. So what we ended up getting in the United States, before it was the United States, was actually a fairly classless, comparatively speaking, regional-less, comparatively speaking, new sound. So what's really interesting is these regional accents that we notice today are fairly new in the history of our country, because early on, till we get into the late 1700s, we don't really hear a lot of comments about regional differences. Now, were there some? Absolutely, because there were founding differences in the settlers. So in New England, you had a lot of people from East Anglia, which is also part of southern Britain. But that was really one of the predominant areas they came from. And so there was this sort of East Anglian accent. And one of the things that's often commented is it has a kind of whiny cadence. And what we find in early sort of discussion of the New England sound is it was often commented on being nasally or kind of whiny sounding, that was a distinguishing feature of New England in the 1700s of the accents there. Now, in Jamestown, we had actually a lot of more aristocratic settlement. So that was a lot of the second sons, the spares in Prince Harry's lingo, where they were the second or third sons of landed gentry. So they were getting nothing. And this gave them, they would get grants of land. And this gave them the opportunity for their own empire, basically. But they had to bring a lot of people with them because God knows they wouldn't want to do the work, right? Because that's not what they do. So they brought a lot of indentured servants with them. And those indentured servants were from the area of London. And actually, most of the aristocratic types were also from that southern British area. So that brought a distinctive set of accents with them, and also a sort of mix of classes, but dominated by those from lower classes. Even though they didn't really have class at that time, it was lower ranks. Even though there were some aristocratic types, they would be far outnumbered by the indentured servants and convicts that were often brought over. Now, I know Australia has that reputation, but that's only because until the late 1700s, we would take them no more. So we had a lot of convicts that were brought over. They were given their freedom to work the tobacco farms. But the key differences was not just where they came from, which were all actually mostly Southern British, so they wouldn't have sounded that differently. It was also the difference in the types of purpose they had for coming here and the religious background they had and the cohesion of the group. So in New England, people came in large groups. They followed a religious leader, or they came with families and friends, or they came together as a religious organized group. But people really just came for money in Jamestown. And they tended not to really care that much about establishing a government that represented the people, or establishing, a religion that was shared by everyone, or literacy. And so these differences in goals really helped establish significant cultural differences between New England and the Southern colonies that then, over time, led to further linguistic differences. And then, of course, Philadelphia was really about the Quakers, or the Society of Friends, and they usually came more from northern Britain. So they came with a different accent to begin with, but they were extremely welcoming of other groups, which the other colonies were not. And so you got a lot of Germans and Scots-Irish, and anybody who wanted to come could come and settle there. So that really led to a completely different dialect over time, because the German and Scots-Irish settlement was enormous in Pennsylvania. And then they spread inland and kind of pushed the frontier. And so that is how, long story short, we end up with three distinct dialect regions of the North, which was sort of the center, New England center, the Midland or Midwestern, which was the Philadelphia Quaker, Scots-Irish, German settlement, and then the South, which was really the Southern British aristocratic kind of Cavaliers who brought a lot of indentured servants and also had a lot of West African language from the enslaved people that they brought over. So can you see how that actually, early on, they were very similar, but then you end up with these three different ideological and cultural areas with different inputs that continued to come in. And that led to eventually regional differences by the 1800s.
And it feels like a Jamba Juice of language blended over time.
Pretty much. We're a melting pot, right? But it's not a complete Jamba Juice, because if you think about the main input and the earliest input, they were British dialects. And the dominant power structure was led by British dialects. So really what you see is like this huge pressure of language influence from British English, and then these sort of small influences pushing in from the side that are making their way into the middle from all these other different language groups. And so the influence was not ever threatening to take over the American language, as the founding fathers tended to call it, as Noah Webster tended to call it. It was more about kind of fraying the edges of it. So it would have influence, but it was never under threat, even though Benjamin Franklin was very, very worried about those Scots, Irish, German, and French that were taking over. So in Pennsylvania, about a third of the population was German and another third Scots, Irish. And Benjamin Franklin openly fretted about the impact that they were going to have on the American language. So, which is interesting when you think about what we hear today about the worries about Spanish. But the reality is there's something called the 3-generation pattern, which means that if you come over to a country with your language, and then you have children there and they have children, by their children, generally your language is lost. And that is overwhelmingly the pattern we still see when new languages come to America.
Yeah, which is why my parents don't speak the language of their grandparents. And Tragically so, I would say.
And my French is very, very bad.
Yeah. So
Très mal, as I might say.
Très mal. Let's get into kind of the funny aspects of why we talk funny and why certain regional dialects are almost like MSG to humor. If you think about Bill Burr, he's funny, but he's funnier still because he leans into the Bostonian accent. Jackie Mason leaned into the New York Jewish thing. Eddie Murphy really sounds so much funnier because he leans into his African-American roots, as do Southern comics, like whether it's, Nate Bargatze, who's really hot right now. How does regional accent actually embellish the funny?
Accents in general, right? So you brought up Eddie Murphy and African-American English, which has a really interesting developmental history that came via the South, but it's really a pan-regional variety, even though there are regional differences in it. It's more of a sort of social accent. So I think we have to kind of broaden it, that these accents that are noticeable, because it's important to realize we all have an accent. Some are just less salient than others.
That's right.
But accents like the ones that you're bringing up, particularly ones that are strongly local, so they place you as being a member of this, usually classed, right? So when we talk about a Boston accent or a New York accent, we're usually bringing up a idea of sort of a working class or blue collar kind of accent. Same thing, with the South, maybe a little less because the Southern accent is more pervasive in movies about kind of Southern gentry as well. But there's a stereotype that's sort of brought to the fore when we use these strongly marked accents that are not just about the way we sound, but they're about who we think people are. And that's really what makes them fodder for comedians, because it's not fair to the people that speak those accents and live a life that's very different than the stereotype, which is most people. But we have very strong beliefs about people and what they're like.
Inferences that we draw based on the way they sound.
Absolutely. Like, think
by the way, erroneously draw.
Mostly. And a lot of this is the way that they're depicted in movies and things like that in books. We tend to use these archetypes that get associated. They're called into play by the accent. So, one of the ways that you create a character that's like gritty and tough in a movie is by having an accent that we associate with grittiness and toughness. But the reality is everybody who's speaking with a New York accent isn't gritty and tough. But that's the stereotype we have. Same thing with the idea of the gangsta accent with African-American English. Absolutely an erroneous stereotype. But we see that in hip hop. We see that in movies, that's really what gets completely pushed out there about what that accent means. So by using that accent as a comic or an actor, what you do is you invoke those ideas. You invoke those stereotypes very easily. It's like the easiest way on earth to invoke those stereotypes. I don't have to tell you, hey, well, I'm referring to like a down on their luck Southerner who doesn't wear clothes, right? I mean, that's sort of the idea I'm portraying by using the Southern accent here. Deliverance. There's a reason those accents were put on those characters, because it sort of drew these stereotypes of these sort of country bumpkin, slightly dangerous Southerners, because that's sort of a cultural stereotype of these sort of, not very open to outsiders, incestuously bred Southerners, right? That's sort of this Appalachian kind of stereotype that is triggered by using a Southern accent completely unfairly, but that is what it is. I mean, there's a lot of lovely people that live there that are absolutely brilliant and don't conform to any of those stereotypes. But by using those as a comedian, what you're doing is you're making your joke, but you're making your joke in that persona that accent draws up, which then makes it funnier, if that makes sense.
So, and I'm going to actually say that on some level, because comedians become our friends, even though we never meet them. I feel friendly toward all of these comedians. Like, they're my friends.
We have
they're the guys who make me laugh quietly.
Yes.
Right. They don't know me, but it's a unilateral friendship. And for me, what it does is it makes the accent more endearing. Like, when I listen to Jamie Tart on Ted Lasso, if you've ever seen the show, where he's from Northern England and he says killy or disgusting, I can't do it. I'm sorry, by the way.
You did pretty well. You did a better job than I do. I've learned in my lifetime just not to try.
Right. But for me, it's like, for me, it feels like an invitation. I was like, oh, wow, I want to get to know you.
Right. Well, this is the other side, right? Why? So then the question is, if we have all these stereotypes that can be invoked by using these accents, why would people still have them, right? Well, because actually what's also invoked really, really strongly with those are solidarity, companionship, friendliness, trustworthiness, a physicality, a support, brotherhood, right? That really is strongly part of what we get from local accents. I mean, that's why politicians adopt them all the time, because it makes them feel not like the guy on TV who's telling you something, right? But the guy at the bar who's hanging with you and talking with you about something. And so that's the flip side is, well, we can make jokes at the expense of people more when we can invoke the stereotypes about them, but we can also make us sort of companions in the joke when I'm calling to you with the voice that invites a companionship, a solidarity, a friendship. And that's absolutely why these accents are so valuable to us as speakers.
And for me personally, I don't know if this is true for other people. I imagine I'm not anomalous with this, but it feels, if I'm hearing a raconteur, a storyteller with a regional accent, it draws me in more because it says to me, I'm about to learn something that I don't know about from a world I might not be familiar with. And I really want to know. So if I hear Frank McCourt talking, may his memory be for a blessing, with his Irish brogue, it's like I'm drawn in. If I hear Maya Angelou speak, it's like, oh, I'm curious. I want to know more. Any of these comedians with the accents, like for me, it feels like it's added, for lack of a better term, it's added value. It's like, I want more.
Right. Well, accents are really the story of humanity. I think we sometimes forget is that accents tell a story about us and without saying anything at all. And I think that's part of what their allure is. And particularly when we're talking about learning something, hearing something from somebody that somehow has an authentic voice, local accents, ethnic accents, they scream authenticity to us. So they sort of invite us into this story that feels like someone is telling us with personal experience to tell it. There's so much beauty in local accents. I cannot even tell you enough how much I love listening to them and studying them and being part of them because they are so incredibly valuable, which is why, when I cast the audiobook for Why We Talk Funny, it was really important to me. We had so much fun casting it because I was like, okay, I want speakers that embody exactly what you were talking about. They embody what I'm talking about in the text. So the chapters are all about different aspects of accent or different accents. So obviously I wanted to be true to that, but I also wanted that same embodiment of the story in the accent. And so every chapter is told by a different accented voice. And I feel like that's the power of having these accents is they tell a story while you're telling a story. It's kind of a story within a story.
One of the things I would want to know, and the reader's just going to have to find out about this in the book, is from a more global perspective in terms of the evolution of language and how these accents evolve. And perhaps, and I'm actually going to ask this one, is there any psycholinguistic implications for how an accent itself might inform our psyche? Maybe we're more prone to pessimism than optimism based on an accent, or perhaps we are faster paced or slower paced, depending on regional tendencies. Can you share with us anything on that front?
Yes. I mean, there's a lot of psycholinguistic research on accents. Mostly, it really is about processing of accents. So, how do we respond to familiar versus unfamiliar accents? And there's a really interesting literature on cognitive fluency and its impact on the way we think about people. So cognitive fluency for people that actually read fun books rather than the torturous ones I like to do in my spare time. People who actually have friends might not know what cognitive fluency is because they're not reading the same things. But cognitive fluency is sort of the subjective experience of how hard something is to process. So it's not actually a measure so much of how hard something is to process, but a measure of how we feel about how hard our brain is working processing things. And when we hear a foreign accent, or even an accent that's just different than our own, we find that people's cognitive fluency is sort of their sense of how hard it is that it's harder. And they might not articulate that or even be aware of it. in terms of thinking it through, but that actually impacts not only how well they understand that accent, but also how trustworthy they find that person, how likable they found that person, which obviously has pretty significant consequences for those of us that walk around with an accent. That is noticeable since we all have accents. But when you encounter someone with a less familiar accent, a lot of times it actually can cause a bit of unintentional negative emotion towards that person, not because there's anything wrong with that person or their accent, but simply because of the sense we have that our brain is working harder. So there's that side of the research. There also has been, there's a little bit of research. I don't work in that area as much, but there is a little bit of research about how personality type might drive use of certain speech features. So I know, for example, they've found that people that rank higher on conscientiousness tend to use more things like filler words and ums and
Really?
And yes.
I would imagine it would be the opposite. That's so interesting.
No, because those are actually speech forms that pay attention to the person you're talking with.
Oh, that's interesting.
When we use
right.
filler words, we're actually, right, they're actually about our relationship and about what I want you to take away and about helping you understand what I'm trying to say and checking that we're on the same page. And so it makes sense from that perspective that if you're a more conscientious person, that you'll pay more attention to those kind of speech features.
I'm tripping about something. I'm nearly positive that Japan in general has greater conscientiousness amongst its population than other places. And there are a lot of these so-called disfluencies like so desho ne, or sign of like ma ne, these things that mean nothing except there's something to say. It's glue with which we connect.
Right.
That is otherwise meaningless, except it's kind of a neurobiological linking.
And that's what a lot of those filler words are. And that would absolutely make sense. I don't know particularly of any research that, measures Japan on that metric compared to other countries and correlates it with features. But I see a paper in your future.
Wow. All right. Let's go present.
I can totally see that relationship, and it would absolutely make sense. And actually, I've just been doing some work on what makes a language beautiful. So are there intrinsic aspects to sounds that can make languages that have more of them more attractive to people? The bottom line is familiarity is really the number one thing that drives our attraction to a language. When we think we recognize a language, even when we're wrong, we tend to like it more. So we find that people that miscode languages, they think they recognize it and actually they don't. They were wrong in what they coded it as. They actually rank those languages much higher than when they know they didn't know them, right? So there's really an interesting correlation. But I know I just saw a paper that studied how some of the characteristics that are associated with an area of study called sound symbolism, which is how sounds have intrinsic meaning, suggested that certain personality types tend to use sometimes the sounds more than others because of the aesthetic effects that they have. So certainly there is work in that area, but it's kind of less frequent than the work on cognitive processing and accent, which is what I'm more familiar with.
Well, Valerie, it's early in the day and you've already made my day. And I want to tell you that I am so excited that you invested your heartbeats in Why We Talk Funny. I think people are going to take great joy. I think that basically it's not the creation of the Tower of Babel, but you're tearing down walls and helping people feel more connected to each other, regardless of regional accent, and maybe in a massive potluck of celebration of these regional accents. It's a beautiful contribution to the literature for the layperson and for the academic alike. So happy you exist and to call you a friend. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was truly delightful. I mean, this is definitely a passion project for me, and I love talking to other people for whom it's a passion, which clearly it is for you. Your accents are a lot better than mine. So this has been a joy. Thank you for having me on.
This is Dr. Adam Dorsay thanking you for listening to SuperPsyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.